Stop the $500 million wiretap that blinded the Kremlin. The line was supposed to be silent. Instead, it hummed, unchanged, routine, carrying base logistics, fuel tallies, and readiness checks straight from the Sea of Okhotsk to shore. 400 feet down, a gloved hand eased a hinged collar around a thick, tar-black cable. No cuts, no splices. The recorder's reels turned in the dark. If they were discovered, it meant an instant diplomatic crisis. If they failed, a decade of priceless silence ended overnight. So how did a US submarine find a single Soviet undersea artery in a basin built to be a fortress and clamp a 20-foot tap that drank secrets without leaving a scar? Find the needle, mapping a secret cable. The Sea of Okhotsk wasn't just water, it was sanctuary. Soviet planners treated it like an inner courtyard, a bastion where ballistic missile submarines could slip out of sight, drill their crews, and wait. If you could hear that courtyard's phone line, you didn't just eavesdrop. You mapped the heartbeat of deterrence. To understand where to touch it, analysts first had to believe the cable existed. That started with habit. The Soviets preferred hardline for inner sanctum traffic, shore stations tied by copper where radio was risky. NSA traffic specialists noticed gaps, shore circuits that went quiet during weather that didn't affect radio, yet logistics still flowed on schedule. Someone was talking off the air. Meanwhile, CIA targets officers pulled port photos, tug movements, and dredge permits, looking for patterns that didn't belong to fishing. Now remember, this is the early 1970s. Precision was math, not magic. But wait, here's the twist. When precision meets paranoia, tiny signals start to look like confessions. SOSUS heard far beyond the horizon, but not cables. Still, oceanographers handed over bathymetry that mattered. The shelf edge off Kamchatka fell fast. A cable wants gentle slopes, predictable depths, and sediment that won't chew the armor. Charts showed a corridor of silted plains inside 400 feet, skirting rock outcrops that would force detours. Lay a ruler on Soviet shore facilities, then bend it through the safest geology. Suddenly, a corridor wasn't a guess. It was a probability. What nobody knew was where that line actually landed. So they used fishermen, not agents, patterns. Trawl logs whispered about snags in strips that made no sense for nets, but perfect sense for a buried object resurfacing where storms shift the bottom. A series of avoid rectangles showed up in local notices the Soviets published for safety, cryptic and bureaucratic. Put those rectangles onto the bathymetry, and the corridor got narrow enough to risk steel. Meanwhile, CIA case officers pushed for indirect proofs. A micro detail in a port photo, spools in a yard that weren't standard for power, got a red circle. A maintenance barge's travel rhythm aligned with known exercise windows, the kind that demanded clean lines for command and control. The picture formed like a Polaroid, faint at first, then sharper, then undeniable. Enter USS Halibut. Officially, she'd been an oddball, once a missile boat, now rebuilt into a prowler with side thrusters and a hangar-turned-workshop the crew called the Bat Cave. Inside, a 2-ton video sled, the Fish, weighted with cameras, lights, magnetometers, and cable sniffers wired to notice metal and field anomalies you'd miss by eye. Navigation would be a knife's edge. Loran gave the big strokes. Inertial dead reckoned between fixes, and seabed beacons closed the last meters. But the trick wasn't getting there. It was hovering inches above a line the enemy didn't admit existed. To choose the first run, the map team laid 3 layers: sediment grain charts, trawl no-go boxes, and shore station geometry. The intersection drew a swath just wide enough to hide a cable trench, but not so wide they'd wander all season. If you're imagining a single pass with a triumphant snapshot, forget it. The sea lies for sport. Current curls cameras, silt blooms blind lenses, and every light you add turns plankton into snow. Halibut slid in slow. The Fish went out on an umbilical the crew treated like a spinal cord, tense, responsive, alive. Magnetometer spikes meant something metallic. But the bottom of the Okhotsk wasn't empty. War junk, anchors, and ghost traps put out false notes. The geometry saved them. Natural lines don't run straight through silt and vanish under bank, then reappear in the same heading 100 meters on. The sled caught a faint artificial curve, nothing like rock. Black insulation, tar-like. The magnetometer made a clean, repeatable rise. Then, a second pass at 90 degrees reproduced it. Manufactured, not nature. The mark had to be covert. No stake, no buoy, nothing a trawler could drag. They dropped acoustic transponders, pings that only meant something if you knew the handshake. 3 beacons, triangulated to a virtual pin. Come back months later, and you could sit right on top of it without a splash. Anyone would notice. A micro-story lived in the Bat Cave that night. A systems tech argued to kill the sled lights entirely when a trawler passed close. The video would go to snow, but the magnetometer would keep faith. They went blind for minutes, breathing through clenched teeth, listening to soundings and the gentle thrum of thrusters fighting current. The trawler never changed course. When the lights eased back on, the curve was still there. The ocean had accepted their presence, for now. What nobody knew at the time was how crucial a pencil note would be. A CIA analyst's margin scribble about sediment grain size shifting near river plumes. In practice, that meant the cable would be buried shallow across a silt fan, then deeper where sand hardened. That variance showed up in the magnetometer profile, gentle peaks, then sharper ones, helping the crew recognize when they drifted off corridor even before beacons confirmed it. The haystack finally had a thread, but finding a phone line is not the same as listening to it. The next question wasn't geometry, it was engineering. How do you touch a live, sovereign cable without leaving a scar and live long enough to come back for the tapes? The Frankenstein sub, USS Halibut, refitted for the impossible. They didn't send a survey ship, they sent a knife. USS Halibut slid out looking like a tired attack boat and went to sea as something else. A machine rebuilt around a single idea: hold still, inches above a secret, without being seen or killed. Start with the bodywork. Halibut's old Regulus missile hangar lost its purpose and found a new one. Inside, welders and pipefitters turned a missile bay into a workshop, dive locker, and launch trench. The crew called it the Bat Cave. It wasn't romance. It was workflow, racks for tools, rigs to cradle a 2-ton sled, a crane that moved like a stage hand in the dark. You could stand in that cavern with the doors shut and feel the ship become a garage at sea. The sled, the fish, looked like a dull grey pallet until it woke up. Cameras in pressure housings. Lights with dimmers because too much light turns water into fog. Magnetometers strung like nerves down its frame to sniff for armor wire and insulation. Cable sniffers tuned for field anomalies that read like a faint hum in the dark. Umbilicals carried power and truth back to the cave, where techs watched needles and grainy video like cardiologists watching a heart. Holding station was the religion. Side thrusters bristled along Halibut's flanks, small compared to a reactor, but stubborn enough to fight a gust under the surface. The navigation stack mixed Loran fixes with inertial navigation that drifted like a memory unless you corrected it. So they planted their own truth on the bottom, discrete transponders, a handshake of pings no one else could parse. Park the ship above a triangle of beacons, and you could solve your own position down to meters instead of hope. Rehearsal taught humility. They built a mock route stateside, a length of cable sunk in a test range, and a pool with silt teased into clouds by gentle pumps. Too much light and the fish's cameras bloomed into snow. Too little and you missed the telltale curve. The lesson was practical. Dim the lights. Trust the magnetometer. Use the video to confirm, not to hunt. In the cave, a micro-story made believers. A junior tech cut the lumens in half, and for the first time the line popped out of the haze as a clean silhouette. The chief didn't clap. He circled the dimmer setting and wrote keep. Diving at depth meant building a pocket of earth inside a tube. The saturation habitat bolted into the cave let divers live pressurized for stretches that would break a normal body. Showers smelled metallic. Coffee tasted like tank air. Jokes landed because they had to. Procedures ran on muscle memory. Checklists taped everywhere in grease pencil, bolt torque sequence, hose purges, comms checks. The margin for error didn't look like drama. It looked like a missing wrench at the wrong time. Meanwhile, the control room learned a new language. Instead of contacts and firing solutions, they spoke in microdrift and load. 2/10 port. Heave comp stable. String quiet. The sled's umbilical was a leash and a lifeline. Too much tension, and you plucked the fish into a dance you couldn't stop. Too little, and the current wrote its own story around your senses. Up in the sail, the officer of the deck stared at a sea that looked empty and imagined the cable right below them, a line they had to never touch. Inside the bat cave, launch and recovery felt like surgery and theater. The fish rolled forward on skids, hung for a beat under the crane, and dropped into a moon pool where grey water lapped against painted steel. Someone always said it, easy, because saying it made the next minute smoother. Once the sled cleared the hull, the cave sealed back to black work. Spares laid out like a pit crew, a cracked lens swapped blind. A magnetometer ribbon retaped, centimeter by centimeter, to keep a flutter from turning into a lie. The quiet genius lived in the navigation watches. Lorang gave you a box. Inertial kept you honest between fixes. The seabed beacons solved the last step. The trick was cadence. Too many pings and you made a pattern someone topside might notice. Too few and you wandered. They wrote a schedule that looked random and wasn't. And when the beacons went silent, they used the bottom itself. Grain size shifts, slope, the way the magnetometer climbed slower over buried sections and sharper over shallow trench. To say you're still on the corridor, even when the ocean muttered back, prove it. None of it mattered without discipline around noise. Every pump, every gear had to read as a normal submarine on some forgettable patrol. The cave doors stayed shut when a trawler drifted close. Lights went down low. Thrusters eased to whisper. In the wardroom, card games paused, and nobody admitted they were counting their own heartbeats. After, the taped deck in the lab whirred, and someone wrote a note on a clipboard. Phase noise acceptable, which meant they'd live to make the next pass. By the time Halibut took her place over the beacons in the Sea of Okhotsk, her crew had turned a repurposed hull into a metronome. Not flashy, precise. She could search. She could linger. And she could do it without leaving anything on the surface except wake that looked like any other American submarine out of place in the wrong ocean, doing nothing special. That was the point. If the ocean never stared, the cave could work. If the cave could work, the clamp could drink. First contact, seeing the line. The first pass wasn't a discovery. It was a rehearsal under pressure. But wait, here's the twist. Rehearsals don't care about your map, they expose your nerve. Halibut eased over the beacon triangle, thrusters ticking in small, polite bursts. In the bat cave, the fish slid into the moon pool, hung for a breath under the crane, then disappeared into grey. The umbilical paid out smooth, a quiet hiss under deck plates. Lights at 1/3, the chief said. Dimmers rolled. Cameras went from glare to dusk. They flew low and slow, the way you do when you don't yet believe your map. The magnetometer line wobbled across the scope, quiet, noisy, then a small, steady rise. Metal, maybe, the tech said, and no one reached for the bottle to celebrate. The Okhotsk bottom kept trophies, anchors, traps, war trash. Garbage lies like treasure until geometry calls it out. The first sighting came sideways. The video showed silt ridges, then a smooth arc that didn't belong, a faint, tar-black curve vanishing into a bank, not a pipe. A pipe sits proud and gathers barnacle. This dipped and reappeared on the same heading 100 meters on. The magnetometer climbed again in the same place. Hold, the pilot said, easing the sled left, keeping the umbilical shy of a snag that could write headlines. They didn't mark it with steel. They stitched it into sound. 3 acoustic transponders had gone down days earlier, each with a handshake that sounded like nothing unless you knew the pattern. The operator pinged one, then another, then solved the triangle into a pin that didn't exist on any chart. Log, the nav said. In the cave, a grease pencil circled a time, a drift, a slope, memory backed up by math. A trawler wandered closer than comfort. Up top, the OOD watched a mast line edge across a horizon that looked empty unless you understood what lived beneath it. Cave dark, the skipper ordered. Lights died. Video turned to snow. The magnetometer kept faith. The fish flew blind for minutes while everyone aboard practiced not breathing too loud. The trawler never twitched. When the lights came back up, the curve was still there, patient, indifferent. The sea had bigger concerns than one more grey hull hugging stillness. They didn't declare victory. They rotated 90 degrees and ran the line again. Natural features don't perform, they meander. This thing kept a heading like it had somewhere to be. The second pass reproduced the first. Same rise, same depth, same arc under silt. Manufactured, the chief said just once, as if saying it louder would break it. False positives got their hour. A length of chain woke the magnetometer and fooled a junior for 30 seconds. A half-buried drum cast a squinting shadow that made the pilot swear under his breath. Geometry and patience burned both away. Chains don't fade and reappear on a compass line. Drums don't vanish under dunes like a living wire. The cable did, because storms bury and expose it on a schedule only river mouths and winter know. Meanwhile, the deck learned to listen to the bottom. Grain size shifts made the magnetometer's shoulder change, soft where silt ran deep, sharp where sand hardened the burial. That CIA margin note about river plumes, grain grows finer here, became a cockpit call. Expect shallow bury in 5. The fish's pilot nodded, trimmed picture hair, and saw the curve emerge faster, closer to daylight. They left nothing anyone could snag. No buoys, no sticks. The beacons lived under inches of sand, pings muted to a handshake you had to ask for. Halibut's log wrote a language only its own could read: beacon phase, drift residuals, sled altitude, tension on the umbilical. The meaning was simple. Come back here on this heading, and you'll sit on the line like you never left. Night in the cave felt like a tight lung. The sled came home wet and scuffed. The magnetometer ribbon got retaped where a flutter threatened a lie. Someone drew the curve from memory, just a line on a whiteboard, then erased it like superstition. A micro-story survived anyway. A junior wanted to bump the lights for cleaner tape. The chief shook his head. Dim wins, he said, tapping the magnetometer trace. Keep the thing that doesn't lie. The haystack finally had a thread, but touching it would be a different kind of nerve. No cuts, no splices, a clamp that drank without a scar. The line was found. Now they had to make it speak. The tap, engineering a silent parasite. Finding the line was the warm-up. Making it talk without changing its voice, that was the act. The rule was brutal and simple. No splices, no impedance change, no hint to any Soviet tech sweeping continuity. Touch the artery, but don't bruise it. That meant induction. Engineers sketched a collar that didn't cut, a listener instead of a thief. Picture a roughly 20-foot assembly with 2 long, hinged halves, each packed with coils. Close it around the tar-black cable, and the tap drinks energy from the magnetic field thrown off by the copper conductors. The cable never opens. No water intrusion. No impedance blip. On Soviet meters, the line stays perfect. In the recorder, it's a whisper turned into tape. Now remember, this is the 1970s. Components aren't tiny, and failure likes the cold. And here, that's where it tightens. Every bolt turns into a bet you make with the ocean. The collar needed spine and grace, strong enough to resist current, compliant enough to settle without biting armor wire. They built shoes along the inner arcs, broad pads with elastomer layers to spread contact and keep pressure flat. Hinged knuckles rode on pins packed for thick grease that doesn't freeze into lies. The talking sequence mattered. Outside bolts first, then inboard, each to a number that lived in a diver's head, because a clipboard at 400 feet is paper you can lose. The clamp wasn't the whole animal. The recorder lived in a shock-isolated canister, pressure-rated and disguised. On the bottom, it looked like clutter, anodized plates scuffed to seabed color, edges softened to avoid throwing straight lines at eyes that know to look for straight lines. Inside, reels weighted, month-long tape at crawl speed, driven by duty-cycled electronics that woke, listened, and slept on a schedule designed to keep power under control and heat quiet. No fans. No ticking that sounds wrong. If you pressed your ear against that canister on the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, you'd hear nothing but water moving. The deployment choreography read like ritual. Divers lived in saturation so they could work minutes that counted. The habitat air tasted metallic, jokes got stale, and the only calendar that mattered was a slate with chalk lines for sleeps. Procedures ate fear. Suits zipped in the same order. Checklists sang the same notes. Clamp up. Talk 1, 2, 3. Hold. Listen. Out of the bat cave, the first collar went down strapped under the fish's frame, cradled to keep the umbilical clear. Halibut held as if tied to a post. In the cave, the load numbers read like a pulse. At depth, visibility went honest, grey to darker grey. The divers felt more than saw the arc of insulation, armored spirals under their gloves like the grain of a rope. "We're on," someone said, a breathy whisper that meant keep your hands slow. The collar opened and folded like a book around the cable, halves kissing with a soft thud the divers felt in their fingers. "Outside bolts," the lead called. Wrenches walked around the ring in sequence, each clicker promised not to overbite. When the halves joined, a magnetometer sanity pass whispered from the sled, "Field steady, no odd spikes." They didn't cheer. They did the second thing that mattered. They listened. The passive pickup line fed a headset. The diver could hear nothing at first, then a faint sizzle under the ocean's hum, like far-off rain. Traffic. Not the words, those lived on the reels, but the proof that energy flowed. Back in the cave, the canister slid down on its own tether and nested into a bed of silt like it had always been there. A short umbilical ran up to the clamp through a loop designed to break clean if a trawler snagged it months later. Fail soft. If anything got pulled, the clamp would stay, closed and mute, while the canister parted. Losing tape was pain. Ripping the line would be war. They tuned camouflage, the way tailors fit a suit. Sharp edges got filed dull. Paint got scuffed before it left the yard. Even the fasteners faced away from likely camera angles. The point wasn't to look invisible. It was to look boring. Seabed clutter in a basin full of industrial trash nobody misses until a diver with orders goes hunting. The last act before departure was silence. Halibut dimmed what she could, trimmed thrusters to the lowest band that kept station, and held while the divers ran hands over every bolt. One glove slipped. A fingertip steadied a socket with pressure that felt like prayer. "Talk good," the whisper came. Up in control, no one smiled. The sled came home. The cave sealed. The beacons went dark. Hours later, a micro-story wrote itself into muscle memory. A junior wanted to spike a quick active ping off the beacons to tighten position before they cleared the area. The chief shook his head. "We've got enough," he said, tapping the drift residual. "Don't feed the ocean any notes it didn't ask for." Halibut backed away like a cat from a ledge, quiet, patient. Above them, the Okhotsk rolled blank and indifferent, surface calm hiding a secret now humming into tape on the bottom. The Parasite drank. The artery never flinched. And somewhere in a translation room far from any sea, a team would soon learn what routine truth sounds
First
like
harvest,
when it stops
what the
pretending
cable
to be
said.
secure. They waited longer than felt sane. Halibut eased back months later, thrusters whispering, beacons waking one by one like old friends. And just when confidence started to breathe, the room leaned in. What if the reels were dead? The clamp looked the same. No scrapes, no odd angles, just a crescent sleeping in silt. The canister came up slow, mud streaming off edges scuffed to boredom. In the bat cave, the lid seals cracked with a soft sigh, and the reels sat there like nothing had happened. The chief ran a gloved finger across oxide. Smooth, continuous. They didn't celebrate, they logged. The first sound wasn't words. It was confidence. Back at a secure room far from any sea, a tech eased the tape onto a transport, and the speakers breathed a low, steady hash. Then a rhythm, tones that marked channels, handshakes that meant traffic merging onto trunk. No spike, no drop, a healthy line. The translator on duty leaned in, pen hovering, and the room went the kind of quiet that makes clock ticks seem rude. A voice came through, perfectly ordinary, like someone calling from a desk in a building at the end of a hallway. Routine voice. Administrative teletype clattering behind it. No encryption on a lot of it. They weren't supposed to hear this. No one was supposed to need to. The first minutes landed like a dare. Fuel tallies, numbers in liters moving from depot to base with the kind of boredom that lives in logistics. A mechanic's request for parts, sent in plain language and answered the same way. Expedite by rail. A shore manager grousing about fresh water outages at a facility, a phrase that meant nothing sentimental and everything predictive. The teletype stream carried movement orders for tugs and service craft, staggered in a way that matched awakening cycles known from satellite shots. A training schedule slipped in, a readiness drill next week, times penciled out against crew rotations. The voices didn't posture, they worked. Skepticism got its hour. Layered deception, a senior muttered, half to himself. If you're on the wrong side of a mirror, you assume the other guy staged it, so they cross-checked. SOSUS had logged nothing new on radio that week, and yet base traffic here stayed smooth. Satellite photos showed a pier going darker, then brighter on days that matched a maintenance gripe about power. Correlation piled up in small, stubborn matches. This wasn't a weather balloon. It was Tuesday in a Navy town. Then the tape found heat. Exercise window advanced, a desk said, voice flat. Submarine sortie postponed, maintenance delay on sonar bay. The translation team underlined it twice, not because the words were colorful, but because they were human. People delay for reasons doctrine hates, and if a delay lived in plain language here, it would echo in the water later. They opened a calendar on the wall, circled 3 days in red, and wrote a note, watch the lane. The traffic had tone as much as content. You could hear fatigue in a night shift clerk slurring a call sign, pride in a base officer snapping out a weather update like it mattered beyond clouds. A critic's voice landed, a readiness drill report, honest and sharp. Team failed to clear line in time. Retrain. No theater. No slogans. A bureaucratic culture speaking to itself without expected audiences. That's where truth lives. A micro-story surfaced in a line hardly worth ink. Long-haul fresh water truck diverted to Petropavlovsk. The analyst who'd circled river plumes in the margin months ago leaned back and grinned, a quiet grin. If the base needed water, the base's systems were down or stretched. A week later, acoustic watchers heard a patrol leave late. Cause and effect across domains that never talk to each other unless you force them to. Teletype hammered out maintenance queues in a format no propagandist would invent. Part numbers, ship names cut to nicknames only locals use, swear words abbreviated because someone got tired of typing all the letters. Voice patches bled announcements. Fishermen avoid rectangle, drag hazards, which on another layer meant cable maintenance zones, the corridor's bureaucratic shadow. They listened to drills as if rehearsals were revelations. Secure from general quarters, a base voice ordered, and the times stamped on paper matched what tales had guessed about Soviet doctrine. Turn rates, ready rooms, response lags. They all live in the friction of ordinary days. That friction is intelligence. Doubters asked for a deception tell. The room found silence where noise should have been. If this were staged, the props would lean too clean. Instead, a call dropped mid-sentence, a line squealed like good copper angry at weather, and someone smacked a handset and said something that didn't translate but meant the same thing everywhere. Flaws made faith. By the end of the first reel, the wall calendar looked like a map. Movement orders, drill critiques, parts delays, water fixes. The voices didn't boast. They complained and planned. That made them priceless. The clamp hadn't changed a syllable on the line. The recorder had simply been there when truth forgot to whisper. The decision to scale wasn't a speech. It was a pencil tapping a date and a quiet sentence. Do it again. Routine under pressure, turning one tap into method. Scaling wasn't bravado, it was scheduling. But wait, here's the twist. Repeat success too cleanly and you start writing a pattern the enemy can read. The first clean reel proved the artery would talk. The next challenge was making it a heartbeat. Drop, clamp, wait, recover. Simple on a whiteboard, treacherous in a basin where one odd wake could end careers and start a crisis. The rule set hardened fast. Repetition without pattern, precision without noise. Halibut and her sisters learned to move like fishermen. Rotations slid into a calendar that never quite repeated. A winter window, blame weather in a log anyone might someday read. A summer lull, write it off to engine trials. Every trip got a cover so boring it survived questions. Oceanographic samples out, maintenance checks in. On deck, crates labeled for geology sat where spare clamp shoes slept. If a long lens counted boxes, it saw a story with receipts. Down in the bat cave, the workflow matured into muscle memory. The fish's pre-dive checks ran on a cadence that shaved seconds where they mattered, not where they showed. Magnetometer ribbons got retaped on the clock. Dimmer settings locked at keep from that first lesson. Spares laid out like a pit lane. Camera housings, elastomer pads, hinge pins, each annotated with the last swap's drift and noise notes. A tech could reach for a part in the dark, and land on the right one because they'd practiced in the dark. Improvement came in quiet increments. Power budgets on the canister extended from weeks to months. Duty-cycle boards waking on a schedule tuned to traffic rhythms, not paranoia. Transducers on the clamp sharpened sensitivity without raising their own acoustic signature. Acoustic blankets on housings got smarter, materials layered to eat frequencies the basin loved to amplify. Back on shore, tape formulations changed. Oxide blends that shrugged off long soaks and temperature swings, feeds trimmed to rates that balanced fidelity with endurance. Each tweak earned a pencil mark and a promise: don't boast, repeat. Navigation refined the last meters. Seabed beacons multiplied into small constellations, each on a handshake that rotated codes so a nosy ear heard nothing repeat. Current models matured. Intake notes on river plumes and seasonal silt got coded into watchstander calls. Expect soft shoulder ahead meant tune the magnetometer's patience. Inertial drift budgets tightened. Watch officers learned to speak in residuals and confidence levels instead of hope. 2/10 starboard, heave comp holds, replaced superstition with numbers. Repetition breeds detection if you let it, so the rhythm flexed. Decoys went to work in the 1970s. Innocuous buoys planted a mile-wide maintenance craft that loitered for no clear reason. Innocuous nets, accidentally, snagged elsewhere to explain trawler gossip. Fishing traffic got misled by paperwork more than hardware. Innocent, a void, rectangles filed where no line lived, so the true corridor stayed dull in bureaucratic ink. If someone did drift too close, Halibut behaved like an annoyed survey. Lights down, doors shut, thrusters whispering boredom. The clamp itself saw revisions the public will never read. A fastener that liked to gall got a new ally. Hinged knuckles picked up micro telltales. Strain gauges buried in metal that sang early if a load shifted wrong. Elastomer shoes changed hardness by a shade, spreading pressure flatter over insulation the divers could feel with gloves like a carpenter checks grain. Quiet wins, the kind no one sees on a brochure. With yield spiking, the question moved up chain. Who hears first? NSA translation rooms wanted raw. Fleet planners wanted calendars. Policy wanted leverage without spectacle. A choreography emerged. Tapes into secure rooms, verbatim out to analysts who cared about tone as much as terms. Complaints, delays, drill critiques. Cross-cues to SOSUS and satellites to kill deception theories in the crib. Then packages to operations, timelines and confidence, not poetry. A commander didn't need transcripts. He needed windows he could trust. Not every window opened. A low-frequency anomaly bled into the clamp feed on a calm night. The magnetometer twitched in ways the bottom didn't explain. The chief listened, then shook his head. Scrub. The boat backed out. A week later, a Soviet salvage tug appeared 3 miles down the corridor, drifted left. Maybe nothing, maybe not. Saying no kept the mission alive longer than any heroic push would have. Inside the wardroom, pride learned a new accent. Divers joked in smaller voices. Engineers wrote shorter notes. The cave doors opened and closed on schedule, but cards paused more often when footsteps thumped over deck plates. Everyone knew repetition was both shield and signal. Make it a habit, not a pattern. By the third cycle, Halibut wasn't a story. She was a method. Drop, clamp, wait, recover. Yes, but also dim, drift, confirm, deny. The beacons pulsed on a schedule only they loved. The tapes whispered the kind of truth that doesn't need adjectives. And every improvement lived where it mattered. Inside a submarine no one admitted was there, working a job everyone promised didn't exist. The intelligence dividend, changing the board. What the line gave wasn't gossip, it was timing. Patrol windows for ballistic missile submarines stopped being educated guesses and started feeling like appointments you could circle. In secure rooms, analysts took the mundane and turned it into movement. A maintenance gripe became a late departure. A parts delay translated into a shortened shakedown. A rescheduled drill hinted at which crew would be ready to sail, and when. The clamp never changed a syllable. It simply let planners hear rhythm. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the ocean. SOSUS nodes and patrol aircraft didn't chase shadows anymore. They watched lanes matched to a calendar built from tape. When a bass voice said, "Exercise window advanced," the watch built extra legs in the GUK gap. When a shore clerk logged, "Sonar bay maintenance delay," a tale that would have pressed earlier held back, conserving fuel and patience. The dividend wasn't fireworks, it was fewer surprises. The first test came quietly. A teletype thread marked a tug schedule shift at a submarine pier, a nothing line unless you cared about pre-departure rituals. 2 days later, a fixed array heard the telltale low-end movement of a slow exit. A P3 laid a sonobuoy line where the board said it would matter, not where doctrine used to say. The contact settled into trail without a single active ping. Everyone involved kept voices flat, the way people sound when the map works. Tone mattered as much as content. The tapes caught frustration in a base officer cancelling a readiness event. Team failed to clear line in time, and that single sentence bled into operations. Don't expect quick turns from that unit next week. A grumble about fuel shipments meeting rail delays told planners which days to expect pier traffic at Petropavlovsk. A ship store request for parts arrived in a format only locals used, nicknames, not NATO designators, and the analyst who'd heard those nicknames before wrote, "Same boat, different week." Names, not just classes, started to stick. Diplomacy felt the edges without seeing the source. When a Soviet patrol appeared where the tape calendar said it shouldn't, late and longer inshore, US deployment shifted screens a hair wider, carrier escorts stacked differently, ASW helicopters launched to bands that the annex tables had taught crews to love. No notes went upstairs saying, "because of a tap." The memo said probable window, with a confidence rating and a bracketed time. People moved steel because the confidence felt earned. There was a day when restraint won quiet points. A tail on a fast attack got a clean classification ladder, yard, then unit, earlier than they'd expected. The urge to press, to see the hull number the old-fashioned way, ran hot for a minute. The skipper chose the tape's calendar over adrenaline and held outside the risk arc. The Soviet ran his route, and the patrol ended with nothing dramatic except the absence of a flare-up no one would have forgiven. The dividends spooled out in policy too. Briefers stopped selling capability like a blunt instrument and started talking in windows and margins. Leaders learned to trust partials that repeated, parts delays that always added 48 hours, drill critiques that consistently pushed a crew's readiness to Thursdays, not Tuesdays. Deterrence turned into posture with receipts, not slogans. You didn't have to sail a carrier into a photograph if you could read the week correctly. Inside translation rooms, humility hardened into craft. They flagged voice habits, a clerk who dropped a call sign at 20, a base operator who clipped syllables when talking to certain desks, and marked them as tells for unit activity. "Same voice," a translator scrawled, and a submarine's life got a contour line. Cross-domain queues closed loops fast. A satellite shot of a darker pier matched a water outage call. A cable, a void rectangle, noticed to fishermen aligned with a predictable maintenance window. Every small corroboration sanded away doubt. One call proved the culture had changed. A naval commander with no patience for poetry asked for an hour, not a lecture. The answer came in 12 plain words. Window opens Friday dawn, closes Sunday dusk. Confidence high, weather permissive. He grunted, moved pieces, and didn't ask where the hour came from. The human factor on the other side cracked through, and that mattered. The tapes didn't paint robots. They caught people swearing about broken seals and fatigue slipping into voices at shift change. Planners stopped imagining flawless doctrine and started planning for friction. Slower turns, messy departures, recovery slop. That shift kept tales alive longer than any heroics ever did. Then a twist reinforced the lesson. A planned exercise jumped a day with no warning in the line. Old doctrine would have chased the phantom. The room held because other tells didn't move. No fuel tallies, no tug shifts, no drill reschedules. The window slipped. The operation didn't. Later, a delayed maintenance note filled the gap, and the board stayed honest with itself. Meaning arrived last. Deterrence leaned away from theater and toward tempo. When you can call a patrol window within hours, you don't need to grandstand. You posture in silence, let submariners trail where it matters, and keep diplomats out of headlines they can't control. The clamp delivered that, not as a miracle, but as a method. The board changed because the hum behind it stopped being noise and started being music you could play without rushing the tempo. Beyond Okhotsk, expanding the net. Success makes noise, even when everyone whispers. After the first clean cycles, the question in closed rooms turned from can we to where else. The Sea of Okhotsk had proven the method, but the method wasn't married to one basin. Copper doesn't care about borders. Bureaucracy does. So expansion became a balance, more ears without more shadows. Plans started with geology, not glamour. Oceanographers laid fresh bathymetry beside shore station geometry the same way they had for Okhotsk, hunting corridors where cables would prefer to live. Gentle slopes, predictable sediment, trenches that hid burial and forced maintenance into patterns. Notices to fishermen in other regions got the same skeptical read. Avoid rectangles, hazard warnings that never said cable but behaved like it. The overlays drew swathes on maps that looked boring and therefore right. Copycat devices weren't copies, not really. Each cable had a personality, different armoring, different conductor twists, different burial depths, and the inductive collars had to drink without biting. Coil counts shifted. Elastomer shoes changed hardness by a shade. Recorder canisters wore new acoustic blankets tuned for local noise. What stayed constant was the rule. No splices, no signature, no scar. If a clamp survived a season, and no line tech cursed a continuity blip, the design paid for itself. Covers matured too. Maintenance stopped being a story and became paperwork. Port entries for oceanographic surveys that matched known university cruises. Shore manifests with crates labeled for salinity sensors sitting where clamp halves slept. Crew rotations that mirrored innocent science schedules. In the 1970s, a boat with a lab stencil on a crate reads, as a lab, if no one lingers long enough to ask for a data set. Compartmentalization frayed as the footprint grew. More boats, more reels, more analysts, more hands signing for things they weren't supposed to know existed. The answer wasn't bigger secrets, it was thinner ones. One team knew beacons, another knew dim settings, a third never heard ocean at all. They tracked tug schedules and watched for water outages that had turned into prophecy back in Okhotsk. The mosaic stayed mosaic by design. Logistics learned to breathe quietly. Tapes moved in bags that never matched. Flights shifted by hours at the last minute. A custody handoff happened in a hallway no one used, 2 floors below where the elevator broke most weeks. If an auditor demanded receipts, the receipts existed and said nothing. Marine samples store cold. No one wrote, Sea of Okhotsk, Channel 3, Tuesday midnight, because paper lives longer than men. The debate sharpened the edges. How much is too much? How often is too often? A commander loved yield until yield raised his pulse at the thought of a salvage tug lingering in the wrong square. Leaders in the late 1970s and early 1980s weighed windows against exposure, listening to translation rooms argue for another cycle, while ops officers circled a date on a calendar and said not this week. The compromise became policy. Stagger routes, write boredom into logs, let hunger live a week longer than pride. Where expansion landed, the method bent to new neighborhoods. In shallower corridors, trawlers felt closer, currents tricked heave comp into bad habits, and the divers' checklists carried extra lines in grease pencil. Cutaways routed this way, fasteners clocked that way, so a snag peeled clean instead of ripping truth into a headline. Here's where it gets interesting. The ocean doesn't punish noise, it punishes certainty. In deeper runs, the collars bulked up to fight drag and settled on sills like dull stones. The canisters slept longer, duty cycles stretched. Trust in tape became a budget item. On the back end, the translation rooms changed their cadence. A new basin meant new voices, different slang, different nicknames, different rhythms for the same bureaucracy. One base spoke in clipped bursts. Another let sentences wander and arrive late. Analysts learned to hear tone before they heard terms. A scrawl on a wall calendar, North Basin gets Thursday, meant less than the sigh inside a call saying the same thing. All of it lived and died on discipline. A cold front hit, and someone wanted to push through on a schedule the ocean didn't respect. The chief circled scrub in a log, and a boat turned away because the pattern mattered more than greed. A salvage ship drifted over a maintenance rectangle that had always been a decoy and left board because the real work sat a mile away pretending to be sediment. A micro-story carried the cost. A supply clerk at a stateside yard saw odd manifests, spares for gear that didn't have a catalogue page, parts labelled with codes that never hit a stock system. Curiosity pricked and stalled at a signature block he didn't recognize. That block was a wall built on purpose. He initialed, filed, forgot. The program lived because 100 small temptations died in quiet. By the time the map put fresh pins beyond Okhotsk, the Empire of Ears wasn't a boast. It was a posture, on paper invisible, at sea patient. In rooms without windows, calendars filled with windows only a few were allowed to read. Expansion hadn't turned a miracle into a machine. It had turned a method into a habit. And habits, done right, don't draw eyes. They just draw truth, the one whisper at $35, 000 that broke a decade. The first clue didn't look like betrayal. It looked like a debt spiral. Ronald Pelton had walked out of the NSA with a head full of code words, a collapsing bank account, and the kind of pride that makes bad options look reasonable. But wait, here's the twist. The most expensive leak of the decade cost less than a sedan. He wasn't a courier with a camera. He was something more dangerous, someone who remembered how the system worked and where it hurt. In January 1980, he did the thing manuals assume no one will do. He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and asked to talk. Not a dead drop, not a brush pass, just a door and a willingness to cross it. A KGB officer listened, tested, and found what they needed. A man who could describe programs by shape even if he never stole a page. Cash followed, not a fortune. An initial $5,000, then more. Over 5 years, roughly $30,000 on top, about $35,000 in all. Not enough to buy a new life. Just enough to keep the old one from collapsing while he sold pieces of the quiet. He didn't hand over hardware. He handed over method. That's the psychological dagger. Once you reveal the shape, the other side learns where to look for the edges. He described a tap in the Sea of Okhotsk that read the Soviets, in a sanctum without a scar. He named value, tape that carried routine voices and teletype, and he outlined how it lived. An inductive collar around copper, a recorder sleeping on the seabed, a boat with odd habits that returned on a schedule masked as boredom. He didn't say Bat Cave or the fish. He didn't have to. He marked a place on the ocean where pride assumed physics would keep secrets. The KGB didn't sprint. They built questions. Twice they flew him to Vienna, October 198 and January 1983, days in safe flats with curtains drawn, debriefers running checklists like surgeons. 8 hours a day he answered, sketched, and confirmed. What did the Americans avoid touching? How often did they recover? If a clamp failed, how did they break clean? He didn't bring documents. He brought confidence. Back in Moscow, planners wrote tasking that looked like fishing advice and read like counterintelligence. Alter patrols. Move a trawler pattern from here to there. Publish fresh. Avoid rectangles. For fishermen in the Sea of Okhotsk that nudged curiosity in the right direction. Then dive. Not loud. Not heroic. Just slow water work on a line nobody officially admitted existed. If the Americans could drink without leaving a scar, the Soviets would check the artery anyway. Here's the twist. When pride learns a new verb, it usually chooses avenge. Meanwhile, satellites in American orbit saw something that ruined a dozen good nights' sleep. In 1981, imagery showed a cluster of Soviet ships, one with cranes and the kind of deck gear that lifts from the deep, parked over the exact square of ocean Halibut's beacons had loved. But wait, here's the punchline. Absence weighs more than evidence when a program disappears overnight. USS Parch went to fetch what it could. Divers found absence. The clamp was gone. Pumps in a secure room on the other side of the world kept humming because the rest of the Empire of Ears still lived, but Okhotsk was over. No press release. No admission. Just a pin pulled from a map and a silence that tasted like metal. It didn't end there, not formally. Pelton kept orbiting his handlers, unhappy with payments and flirting with dropping contact, then returning for another debrief. The KGB kept him on schedule as long as the answers stayed useful. Across the Potomac, counterintelligence watched anomalies stack. Patrols shifted without doctrine, salvage tugs loitered in the wrong rectangles, and a name surfaced in whispers that never got loud enough to use. The break came from a direction no one planned. In July 1985, a KGB colonel, Vitaly Yushchenko, defected briefly to the United States and started talking. Buried among stories of tradecraft and grievance sat a detail that mattered more than anything else he said. A description of an American who had sold secrets about a submarine cable tap and more. The sketch fit Pelton like a suit. And here's the twist. Sometimes the loudest confession is a casual aside. The FBI called him in under pretext and let the conversation hang. He tried to talk his way out of his own outline, half confessing in that dangerous zone where pride and denial live. Then the edges closed. In court, the numbers looked almost insulting. $35,000 for a decade's worth of nerve and engineering. He wanted $400,000, he told his handlers once. He got a tenth of that and a life sentence. The real bill landed elsewhere. The program that thought the ocean would keep its confidence learned a lesson it didn't want. Physics protects you until people get involved. Inside the rooms where the clamp had first been drawn, the reaction wasn't theater, it was inventory. Abort orders drafted for routes that now looked risky. Sanitized plans pulled from drawers and rewritten. What to burn, what to box, what to pretend never existed. And the psychological tell, nobody raised a voice, because discipline is what you do when adrenaline begs you not to. In the translation bays, a wall calendar lost a circle that had been there for years, and nobody touched the empty space with a pen. The line in a Soviet report that mattered most read like a bad joke, "Inductive device suspected." That sentence ended a chapter, not the book. The method lived. It moved into other seas, other corridors, and eventually into a world of fiber optics where physics changed the taps and the missions learned new verbs. But in Okhotsk, the Parasite starved. One man, small money, catastrophic leverage. The moral arithmetic never settled. Pelton wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who chose wrong and kept choosing it. The KGB didn't perform magic. They listened, adjusted, and sent divers where pride had said no one would go. The price was paid in steel, in silence, and in the way a crew in a bat cave somewhere learned to live with a new rule written in grease pencil. Assume the ocean tells someone. Discovery, when the sea looks back. It didn't start with a broadcast. It started with shapes. In 1981, surveillance satellites caught a cluster of Soviet hulls loitering exactly where the beacons loved to talk. That's when the ocean did something rare. It stared back. Not patrol craft out for air. A salvage vessel with cranes and odd deck rigs sat centered like a pin through a map. On the American side, the room didn't raise voices. Someone traced a square with a pencil and said, "They're over the line." USS Parch got the quiet order everyone understood without adjectives. Make best speed. Recover what you can. Don't be seen becoming the story. She slid into the box on a schedule tuned to nerves, not tide. Divers went out under discipline that had kept people alive in bad water for years. The bottom answered with absence. No crescent in the silt. No scuffed canister edges. Only sand ripples and the ghost of weight where something heavy had slept. Up top, the log got one sentence. No joy. In secure rooms far from salt, a calendar lost a circle and nobody wrote in the white space. The Soviets didn't crow on radio. They choreographed. Photographs leaked, careful angles, a steel curve on a deck, divers framed against grey water. The story arrived timed to bruise without boiling. A cable had been touched, a device recovered, sovereignty avenged. No technical details worth a manual, just enough theater to make the point. The ocean looks back. On the American side, the scramble ran on verbs that never made headlines. Abort, sanitize, box, burn. Ops officers pulled contingency binders and flipped past the warm language to pages that mattered, what to deny without lying, what logs to bury in routine, which routes to ice for a season, because habit becomes evidence if you let it. A tap isn't an object. It's a choreography. Unwind the rhythm and you keep more than gear alive. Inside translation rooms, the tapes kept their posture. Other basins still whispered truth on schedules that didn't respect press cycles. But Okhotsk was a closed door now. A briefer stood at a board, tapped the gap where a reel used to land twice a year and said, "Do not compensate by pressing elsewhere." It wasn't gallows humor. It was policy. Pride pushes. Method survives. Soviet patrol patterns shifted in small, mean ways. Trawlers wandered, by accident, into rectangles nobody had cared about before. Diver teams trained where fishermen would swear beneath their breath. Maintenance notices to local crews leaned harder on hazard language, and avoid boxes multiplied like ink blots. The basin that had felt like an inner courtyard learned to check its locks. Meanwhile, Parch's divers ran a second grid just to be sure the absence wasn't a trick. A current seam hissed against their suits, a reminder that the sea edits even honest plans. They logged micro-features, scratches in silt that might have been rigging drag, a scuff on a rock that looked too clean for age, and climbed back to steel without the prize because sometimes steel isn't the point. Sometimes the point is not giving the ocean more names to remember. Diplomacy felt heat without spark. Notes moved between desks in words designed to cool. They reaffirmed rights, regretted incidents, promised nothing. Internally, the language got sharper. "Do not create a boarding event," one guidance memo read. If a Soviet auxiliary edged into bad distance, the answer wasn't doctrine. It was muscle memory. Doors shut, lights down, thrusters whisper, leave them nothing to film. A micro-story surfaced on a different deck. An aging canister from an earlier cycle, long retired, seals tired, got a quiet funeral where no one clapped. 6 bolts loosened, a flag folded, a short prayer in 2 languages, then weight slides off a plank and the ocean closes over metal that once listened without judgment. Respect and regret in the same hour. The crew went back to work. Controlled leaks from Moscow did their job. A photo in a paper no one kept in a scrapbook. A line in a broadcast countries pretended not to monitor. The implied sentence under all of it wasn't poetry. It was practical. "We can see you." In rooms that plan without adjectives, the answer wasn't retaliation. It was migration. The method stepped sideways to other corridors, other covers, eventually other physics. That's the part no one outside the rooms loved. The tap died in that theater, but the habit it proved didn't. You don't abandon a language because one conversation ends. You change dialects. You teach crews to dim earlier, drift finer, and treat every successful pass as rented time. The sea will return the favor by reminding you it's not your friend. It's your mirror. And in 1981, the mirror blinked. Legacy, from copper to glass. Copper told its secrets easily. Glass doesn't. After Okhotsk, the line that mattered moved from armored copper to fiber-optic glass, repeaters spaced like beads across oceans, lasers whispering in light instead of voltage. The physics changed, but the instinct didn't. If you can reach the seabed unnoticed, you can learn what travels there. The question turned from, can we listen, to where do we touch without breaking the world? The Cold War left a blueprint. Don't cut. Don't change load. Don't leave a scar. Under fiber that meant thinking around light, not through it. But wait, here's the twist. When content locks up under encryption, rhythm becomes the message. Repeaters became choke points, hardened housings that boost signal and manage wavelengths. If you could work near them without tripping alarms, you might read side-channel leakage, metadata about who talks to whom and when, even if the payload wore strong encryption. The game shifted from content to structure. The calendar became the commodity again. Hardware evolved in the same quiet grammar. Submarines kept their secrets inside hull plugs and ocean interfaces, places to stage ROVs and UUVs the way the Bat Cave once staged the fish. A boat like USS Jimmy Carter went to sea with a sealed middle section that might as well be a workshop at depth, sized for tools, no brochure names. ROVs flew where divers shouldn't, manipulators gentle enough to lay a fingertip on a glass house and never scuff it. The old rule lived in new metal. Fail soft, break clean, look boring. Covers matured into habits that didn't need scripts. Oceanographic fronts stayed useful. Real science missions sailed alongside covert ones, and logs read like salinity and plankton until they didn't. University instruments moved in the same lanes as gear that had no catalog page. A crate labeled for a conductivity sensor might hold an acoustic hood for an ROV camera lens. When a satellite stared, it saw a small ship loitering near a maintenance rectangle and lost interest. Boredom remains armor. Legally, the fog thickened. Territorial seas, exclusive economic zones, cables that cross sovereign shelves. Every phrase gave diplomats a lever and operators a headache. The language got careful. Glommer responses hardened from a sentence into a reflex. Neither confirm nor deny turned into policy muscle memory. Here, that's where it gets interesting. Silence isn't emptiness, it's architecture. If acknowledging existence exposes method, you decline the premise. Quiet work lives longer in dull words. On the seabed, the conversation rarely sounds like movies. Nobody taps a modern trunk and downloads an internet. Fiber optic payloads arrive encrypted at scales that make arrogance look amateur. But metadata still sings. Latency, timing, routing behavior inside repeaters. A careful instrument might watch clock drift and handshake rhythm, correlate surges to events, and feed that into models that say more than any headline. The dividend looks familiar. Windows, not slogans. Calendars, not trophies. Adversaries learn the same lessons. Research vessels with too many antennas wander near trunks. Survey platforms carry ROV garages sized for jobs that don't publish papers. A mother ship in the right weather and make a small robot vanish into a cable field where AIS gets spotty and curiosity blows away in whitecaps. Under flags and budgets, the seabed turned into quiet territory. Sensor grids, listening posts, nodes that promise deniability if anyone asks the wrong question. So navies wrote a new discipline. Protect, don't panic. Patrol lanes broadened to include cable corridors as strategic ground. Notices to mariners did double duty. Safety, sure, but also decoys. Avoid rectangles that sometimes said, work here, when the real work sat a mile away. Operators trained for no boarding incidents, the same way their grandparents trained for depth charges. Doors shut, lights down, give the camera nothing but weld lines. If someone drifted too close, the answer was choreography, not theater. Industry changed too. Cable owners built smarter repeaters, tamper-evident housings, watchdogs that notice pattern changes. Damage detection matured. A tug's anchor bite looks different on fiber stress than a curious manipulator's brush. And algorithms learn to call the difference at 3 a.m. maintenance ships, rehearsed showing innocuous gear to inspectors and keeping interesting gear behind a bulkhead no one opens. Risk became a budget line. And the people, they learned humility again. In secure rooms, analysts stopped promising content and started selling posture. We can't read payload, but the route just shifted, latency jumped, and someone lit a new wavelength unannounced. That sentence moves decisions without lighting headlines. It's Ivy Bell's logic in fiber clothes. Read the rhythm, don't invent the melody. A micro-story survived in a training bay. A young ROV pilot wanted to goose the lights for cleaner video. The chief shook his head, tapped the dimmer, and spoke the old phrase, "Dim wins." The feed stayed grainy, the manipulator stayed gentle, and the mission came home invisible to everyone but the people who needed to sign the tape log. Across decades and physics, the habit held, trust the thing that doesn't lie. None of this produces parades. It produces minutes, extra time on a crisis clock, options you don't need to announce. Fiber turned the clamp into a metaphor, the bat cave into a doctrine, the calendar into a weapons system without a name. From copper to glass, the legacy isn't a device. It's a way of working. Plant facts, move quiet, assume the ocean tells someone. And when it's your turn at the eavesdropping, keep it low. Safety versus secrecy. Here's the knot the clamp never solved. When does listening keep the peace? And when does it light a fuse? Ivy Bell's wasn't just an engineering trick. It was a policy gamble that said truth gathered in secret steadies hands in public. That sounds clean until you count the ways a secret can trip. Start with the case for listening. Deterrence lives on prediction. When you can call a patrol window within hours, you don't escalate by guessing. Crews trail with wider margins. Carrier screens shift without drama. A crisis that could sprint becomes a walk. The tapes weren't trophies, they were breaks. And in rooms where minutes cost blood, breaks matter more than headlines. Then the case against. Eavesdropping invites the question nobody wants to answer under cameras. What happens if they catch you? Ivy Bells learned that in 1981, when shapes gathered over Okhotsk and Parch found absence, nobody fired, nobody boarded. That was luck shaped by discipline. But a salvage tug a mile wrong and a captain on a bad day can turn physics into politics fast. A device on a deck is propaganda. A boarding ladder is a war story. So policy learned guardrails. Front-load deniability. Build exits into plans. Hardware got soft fails. Breakaway loops, clamps that let go clean if a trawl bit wrong. Because denying a crisis is easier if you never give it a satisfying video. Operations rehearsed, no boarding incidents until they were muscle memory. If a hull edged too close, doors shut, lights died, thrusters whispered, and the ship became something a camera couldn't sell. Even the language learned to slow down. Neither confirm nor deny turned from a sentence into a habit that carried programs through storms without inventing new ones. There's a moral edge inside the wire too. You're hearing ordinary people doing unglamorous work. Fuel tallies, water outages, drill critiques. Does the absence of encryption make it fair game? Law and custom say espionage sits outside polite rules. Ethics says routine truth isn't free just because it's poorly guarded. The translators didn't need lectures. They wrote "do not quote tone" and scrubbed names that didn't matter to movement. Utility, not voyeurism. Meanwhile, something else unsettled the room. Success tempts repetition, and repetition teaches arrogance. Once the calendar worked, a planner could start treating windows as birthright. That's how secrets fail. The fix was procedural humility. Crosschecks hardened. An anomaly without a second source didn't move steel. A sudden exercise advanced. Call didn't trigger launches unless tug schedules, water fixes, and SOSUS agreed. Believe patterns, not miracles. What about the other side's rights? Cables don't respect borders once they cross shelves. Fishermen read, avoid rectangles that hide a nation's arteries. A diver in a suit doesn't see doctrine, he sees hazard pay. Listening turned those lives into risk without their consent. So teams learn to be boring on purpose. No scars, no blips, no nets torn because a clamp sat proud. If a trawler could go home cursing weather instead of conspiracy, that was a win. The grey thickened with fiber optics. Payloads encrypted hard, repeaters smarter, legal zones louder. The ethics didn't simplify. If you can't read content, is metadata fair? Timing, latency, routing, those can outline lives at scale. Policy bent back to the same old test. Will this reduce surprise or produce spectacle? If the answer leaned towards spectacle, the better answer was don't. A micro-story tied it tight. A junior intel officer pitched a risky lift to prove presence ahead of a diplomatic round. The chief circled a word on the board, coherence, and said presence without pressure buys nothing. The pitch died. The next week, a window landed clean anyway because the clamp's logic, rhythm over theater, still held. Here's the quiet truth veterans carry like a pocket rule. Safety isn't silence. It's informed silence. Secrecy isn't power. It's liability unless it buys minutes. Ethics lives where those two meet. If listening narrows the odds of a ladder, a flare, a captain on a radio inventing heroics, keep it. If it heats a map for pride, kill it. Assume the ocean tells someone. That line, grease pencil on a cave bulkhead, wasn't paranoia. It was ethics disguised as caution. Work so clean nobody needs to lie. Plan so dull nobody wants to film. Listen so carefully that the only thing you change is your own timing. That's the math Ivy Bells wrote in Salt. Safety cheaper than secrecy. Secrecy only as heavy as it has to be, and the clamp never worth more than the minutes it quietly buys. Human cost, divers, analysts, and a man who chose wrong. Bodies at depth, minds in rooms, lives bent by secrets. That's the ledger no briefing writes down. In the Batcave, routine was a shield and a tax. Divers lived in saturation where time turned into chalk marks on a slate. Sleep, suit, clamp, listen. The air tasted like pennies and stale jokes. They ritualized fear into checklists because checklists keep hands from shaking when a glove slips on a bolt that shouldn't be over-torqued. A micro-gesture mattered. Tap a wrench once, not twice. Breathe on the count. Feel insulation with fingertips until the spiral armor reads like braille. They learn to move slow in water that steals heat and forgiveness at the same speed. No medals fix a night when a trawler's wake rattles the umbilical, and the only thing between calm and headlines is a lead's voice staying level. Hold. Outside, bolts only. On deck, they burned through luck deliberately. Every return meant a debrief that sounded bored on purpose. Dim wins, the chief said, and nobody rolled eyes anymore. A torn elastomer pad got circled in grease pencil and a promise made to no one. Swap hardness one shade, shave the edge, file the corner. They learned to bury triumph with the same care they buried beacons. Ashore, analysts paid in hours and silence. Translation bays hummed on a diet of routine truth that would never get a parade. They sharpened pencils to the same length and kept wall calendars that mattered more than birthdays. You don't cheer a maintenance delay that keeps a boat pierside. You underline it twice, pin it to SOSUS, then call a commander and give him a bracket and a confidence level he can live with. A junior wrote probable and got a finger tapped on his desk. Odds, not hope, a senior said, and the word became a habit that saved fuel and pride out at sea. They carried the weight of hearing people who never meant to be heard. A shore clerk cursing a pump seal, a base officer lecturing a drill team, a night shift voice yawning at the wrong time. The ethics lived on sticky notes no one would ever file. Scrub names that don't matter, kill tone unless tone is timing, don't make art out of work. In that restraint sat respect. The cost of secrecy stacked where families live. Divers came home with a new superstition. Don't hang wet laundry on Sunday, don't say the word lucky out loud, don't change the nail where you keep your keys. Analysts learned to answer, "How was your day?" with a smile that meant, "Don't ask." Spouses kept calendars that moved without explanation. Kids learned the shape of a hush and called it normal. And then there was the man who chose wrong. Ronald Pelton wasn't a ghost in a trench coat. He was a human arithmetic problem, debt notes, pride, a door he could have walked past. He sold method for small money and carved a hole in a basin where divers had steadied clamp halves with gloved prayers. In a courtroom, his number, about $35,000, landed like an insult beside the years of quiet that bought minutes for other people's sons. D wanted more, he told the KGB once. He took less, and the balance due didn't disappear. It landed in steel, in calendars with empty circles, in orders that said scrub when pride wanted press. The tip that unmasked him arrived by a path he couldn't predict. Vitaly Yushchenko's brief defection, a sketch that fit, a conversation where Pelton tried to talk around himself and wrote his own outline in the air. The image you don't see is the translation room the next morning. Someone erased a pin. No speeches, no slammed doors, just a hand finding rubber and wiping a circle slow. The crew carried on because work like this joins your bones. A diver wrote, "Assume the ocean tells someone on a bulkhead," and erased it the next day, not because it wasn't true, but because truth doesn't need decoration. An analyst left a note over a console, "No heroes," and meant it. A commander made a call not to chase because a clerk's water outage didn't match a tug's shift, and that boring restraint tasted like victory when the ocean didn't hand him a ladder and a camera lens. Victory without parades, scars without names. That's the human cost, minutes bought by people who never get sentences written about them, and one man whose sentence will always be read first for the wrong reason. They all share a quiet fact. The sea keeps what it wants. You do the work anyway. Ivy Bells turned a whisper into a method, timing over theater, minutes bought in silence by hands that never shook on camera. If you want to see how that habit crossed into fiber optics and seabed shadows today, watch the next story. Subscribe for more true operations pulled from sealed files. We'll show you where the dimmer still matters, how facts get planted, and why the ocean keeps telling someone.